All right, so we talked about the skeletal system and the basics of that. Let's delve into bone tissue, which is, of course, the main component of the skeletal system. Not the only one, by any means, but it's the main component of the skeletal system. So first off, we know that bone is a connective tissue. Just to remind you, connective tissue up here. Connective tissues have scattered cells and are primarily composed of extracellular matrix. Now, most of the extracellular matrices that we've talked about thus far have been fibrous, right? So they had, elastic fibers, reticular fibers, and primarily collagen fibers laid down in various ways, and ground substance. Ground substance was the fluid that was between the fibers. It was usually a gel-like matrix that was water, small molecules, proteoglycans, glycoproteins, and things like that. Osseous tissue, which is a fancy word for bone tissue, it contains all of those things. But it also contains large numbers or large amounts of inorganic salts, crystallized salts. So by weight, if you were by dry weight, you take a living bone and you dry it out, right? I mean, it's really hard to do that without killing it. But you take a fresh bone and you dry it out. What you would find is that about 1/3 of its mass is going to be organic, and about 2/3 of the mass is going to be inorganic. So when we say organic and inorganic, remember that the organic, that is all of the carbon compounds, all the protein, all the carbohydrates, all the lipids, all the glycoproteins and proteoglycans, and the vast majority of everything that you would find in other tissue. That's 1/3 of the mass of osseous tissue. This organic matter is synthesized by osteoblasts. Osteoblasts, osteo means bone, and anything that says blast is a stem cell that usually is going to build something, right? And specifically osteoblasts build bone. They're bone builders, right? And they make the organic matter of the of bone tissue. And that organic matter primarily consists of collagen. Collagen is by far the main component of it. All right? Collagen fibers, carbohydrate protein complexes, so these are going to be proteoglycans, glycoproteins, and glycosaminoglycans. Those are all various ways that you can combine proteins with carbohydrates in various ratios. And in your standard, like, say, dense, irregular connective tissue, that's most of what you would find, right? The collagen would be the primary fibrous portion, and the glycosaminoglycans, the proteoglycans, and glycoproteins would be the ground substance that's filling up all that's in between. In bone, you make that collagen and you have your ground substance, and then what happens is that around the collagen you crystallize an inorganic matrix, and this inorganic matrix is mostly calcium salts. It's about 85% hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite is a fancy way of saying calcium phosphate. And it's actually calcium phosphate with a little bit of calcium hydroxide. And it's calcium hydroxide is formed into its crystalline matrix. It helps make it harder. But it's primarily calcium phosphate. It's about 10% calcium carbonate. And the last 5% is other stuff. Magnesium, potassium, sodium, and fluoride. And they perform various roles, but mostly they help to sort of stabilize the bone and hold it together. And this is going to be crystallized around the organic matter. So, like, let's say that you have, you're laying down your collagen fibers here in pink, and then around those collagen fibers here in blue, you have your hydroxyapatite crystallizing. And so it'll, like, first it'll coat the collagen fibers a little bit on each side. And so you see here we've got this core of collagen fiber with hydroxyapatite and calcium salts that are coating it. But we still maintain the core of that collagen protein. That gives this structure, bone, extracellular matrix, great strength and flexibility. The strength, the hardness is provided by the calcium salts, which are basically rock. There are a lot of rocks, or what we would call rocks, that are basically made out of calcium salts. But the collagen is flexible, and so with most, hard minerals, you hit them hard enough and they shatter and they break, and then nothing holds them together. So, like with this, let's say that you were to deliver a nice hard blow to it, you might cause, boom, like a little breakage in, not a big break, not like a shattered bone or anything, but you just got like little micro cracks in your calcium matrix. But the collagen doesn't mind it. So the collagen stays there, and it sort of holds the bone together long enough for cells to come in and patch up the matrix. So you have something that has the flexibility of collagen while having the strength of the hydroxyapatite, and that's what bone is, right? And that's what makes bone so awesome. So that's the extracellular matrix. That's like most of the weight of your bones, right? So most of your bones is the extracellular matrix, which is that organic, mostly collagen, and inorganic, mostly hydroxyapatite. But that stuff didn't get there by magic. It was put there. And it was put there by cells. Cells are extremely important to bone structure. They're what makes bone structure. They're what changes bone structure. And there are 4 bone types, or 4 types of cells that you will find in bone. 3 of them are related to each other. Osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, and osteocytes. And these are all related. Osteogenic cells are like the main stem cell. Osteo, bone, genic, to generate. All right. These are actually going to be found in the osteogenic layer of the periosteum. And these are like stem cells. They're gonna divide and like they divide and they divide and they divide. And when they divide, they make more osteogenic cells. But sometimes when they divide, they can make an osteoblast. And osteoblasts are cells that build bone. What they do is they glom onto the outside of the bone, and they secrete bone extracellular matrix. Mostly the collagen and the glycosaminoglycans and proteoglycans and all of the stuff that you find in the ground. So they lay down that bone extracellular matrix, the organic portions of the bone extracellular matrix. Once that organic portion is formed, the calcium salts will just sort of crystallize on it automatically. It's actually, like, there's some stuff that's secreted that catalyzes them to hold on to the collagen, and you've got, like, it's a sort of some special components in there, because obviously bone crystallizes around the collagen in your bones. It doesn't crystallize around the collagen in, say, your skin. At least not very often. So it's, you get some special collagen going on. There's some special other things that are going to cause the inorganic portions, the hydroxyapatite, to crystallize around it. But the osteoblast is laying down those collagen fibers. And then where the collagen fibers are controls where the hydroxyapatite crystallizes. Once an osteoblast has laid down bone matrix all around it, well, it's now going to be basically boxed in. All right? It's made bone all the way around itself. It's now sealed in. It can't go anywhere. And so it then becomes an osteocyte. And this is a cell. It's going to be found inside of a lacuna, inside the bone tissue, and put out little tendrils here in the canaliculi of the bone. And they maintain and nurture the bone extracellular matrix around them. And so these three are all in a chain. Osteogenic cells become osteoblasts. Osteoblasts become osteocytes. Our fourth type of cell is called an osteoclast. Osteoclasts cleave. Clast. So think clasts cleave, blasts build. You not just need to make bone, you've also got to be able to get rid of bone. You are constantly remodeling your bone, which means that you're taking away old bone and laying down new bone and changing the way your bones look. This process is called, this process of dissolving bone is called resorption. All right? Osteoclasts are huge cells that are actually formed by the fusion of many stem cells. These stem cells that fuse together to make up an osteoclast are actually blood stem cells, and they come from the blood cell line. But they fuse together to form an osteoclast, and the osteoclast has, on one side, it has this ruffled layer, and the osteoclast which again is this big, huge cell, lands on the bone, where it's directed to by various hormones, and it then secretes a substance that will dissolve bone. It basically secretes an acidic substance that will solubilize the calcium salts, so it destroys the hydroxyapatite, and then it releases a enzyme that will cut apart the collagen fibers of the extracellular matrix. So the calcium is solubilized and flows away, and then the extracellular matrix, the organic collagen, is removed so that the calcium salts don't recrystallize. And so wherever this osteoclast lands, it sort of starts building a little pit and resorping the bone, basically dissolving the bone right there, and then it'll move somewhere else. So you've got two types of bone in your body: compact bone and spongy bone. And we've already talked about this a little bit in lab, but I just want to reiterate the structure of these two types of bones. So compact bone is primarily going to be found in long bones, though you will find a little bit of it on the outside of flat bones and irregular bones and everything like that. Most bones have an outer coating of compact bone, but you're going to find really thick layers of compact bone in the in your long bones. Compact bone is arranged in osteons. Like the basic unit of a compact bone is an osteon. And so you can see this here from there to there. That's an osteon. And the osteon consists of a central canal. Oops. Consists of a central canal through which an artery, a vein, and a nerve run. And then you have circular layers of cells surrounding it. And so you'll actually have a layer of inorganic tissue, hydroxyapatite, and then you'll have a layer, a circle of cells, and these are osteocytes. And then you'll have another inorganic hydroxyapatite layer, and then you'll have another cell layer, and then another hydroxyapatite layer, and then another cell layer, and this repeats until you get to the edge of the osteon. Right? You might have various amounts of layers, but we're talking like between, maybe 2 to 5 layers, and each of these layers is called a lamella. Lamella just is a word that means layer. Right? And they form in rings around the central canal, and those rings are actually cylinders that go down and follow the central canal as it goes down. So this ring here is of hydroxyapatite tissue, actually extends down next to the canal. This ring of cells, well, it isn't just a ring of cells. Those cells actually go down in a line next to the central canal. So you see here we got like a line of cells, and each lamella is basically a line of cells going down next to the central canal. The hydroxyapatite portion, all right, so what you see here in between the cell layers and running down there, that hydroxyapatite portion is 1/3 organic collagen, mostly, going down in the same direction as the length of the long bones. The collagen fibers are going down this way, and they're crystallized with hydroxyapatite. Surrounding the cell, so inside of the bone, the compact bone, you'll see these osteons. And osteons are round, and round things don't pack perfectly. So you're gonna see some areas where you've got some cells and some bone matrix that like isn't necessarily part of an osteon. So like this area right here isn't part of an osteon. This little bit up here isn't really part of an osteon. Same over here. Though that's called interosteal lamella or interosteal tissue, or interstitial lamella right here. And that's just the region in between the osteons. And then around the outside, you will usually have a couple of layers of lamella that, instead of being around an osteon, go around the entire bone. So you can see here we have a ring of osteocytes. And here we have another ring of osteocytes. And those aren't going around an osteon, those are just going around the entire bone. And those are called the circumferential lamella. And then outside of them, we have the periosteum. And the periosteum has two layers. It basically has what's called the osteogenic layer, which contains osteogenic cells and osteoblasts, and that's the one that like faces the inside of the bone. And that's only a couple of cells thick. And then you have some dense, irregular connective tissue with its collagen fibers in it, and that's what makes up most of the periosteum. And those collagen fibers of the periosteum actually join in to the bone and become the ossified, the calcified fibers that make up the bone structure. And they actually, the fibers that get off of the periosteum and then enter into the bone are called perforating fibers, and they enter into the bone through these little areas called perforating canals. And those perforating canals also allow nerves and blood vessels and that sort of thing to enter into the bone and become part of a central canal. There are also these smaller canals that move between central canals, and those are called transverse canals. The central canal is also sometimes called a Haversian canal, though that's older terminology that isn't being used very much. And the perforating canals are sometimes called Volkmann canals. Our second type of bone, spongy bone, is actually laid down very, very differently. So instead of having, you know, lots of hydroxyapatite extracellular matrix, and then a ring of cells, and then more hydroxyapatite matrix, and then another ring of cells, and then more hydroxyapatite matrix, and another ring of cells, that leads to a very, very, very dense, compact, strong structure. Spongy bone is going to consist of these slivers and little plates of bone that are only like a couple of cells thick. And there are these little slivers, these little spiky things, and those are called spicules. And then we have these thin plates, and those are called trabeculae. Although, when you have a bunch of plates and spikes together, we usually just call it trabeculae. Sort of trabeculae includes spikes if you're talking about everything together. And they're going to be coated with endosteum. Endosteum is sort of like the periosteum, except it just has the osteogenic layer. So these spicules and trabeculae are going to be coated with like usually a single layer of osteogenic cells. And then in between these spicules and trabeculae, we'll have red bone marrow. You will have few, if any, osteons and no central canals. The role of central canals in compact bone is to make sure that all of these lamella of osteocytes have nutrients flowing to them through the blood, and so that's carrying oxygen and nutrients and everything like that, so that the bone can live. However, the spongy bone, since all spongy bone, all of these trabeculae are only like a couple of cells thick, and they're all surrounded with red bone marrow, which is highly permeated with blood vessels. All of them are going to be near a blood vessel of one sort or another, so there's really no need for any sort of central canal, because every cell is going to be close to a blood vessel and will be perfectly well nurtured. So compact bone tissue is strong. It's also heavy. Spongy bone tissue is not as strong, but is still strong. But it weighs a lot less. So it provides strength with minimal weight. Here you can see some tissue sections of spongy bone. And so let's highlight this up here. The trabeculae is this area here. That's trabeculae on both sides. This is like a little plate of bone tissue, and you can see that that plate of bone tissue is only a few cells thick. And that's bone. So that's calcified extracellular matrix right there. And it's coated with a layer of endosteum, endosteal cells, osteogenic cells. And in here, let's do it in red, all of this stuff in here, this is what's called the marrow cavity, and the marrow cavity is going to be highly vascularized with lots and lots of blood vessels running through it, endosteal tissue, osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteoclasts, everything like that. Right? So all of that area is going to be bone marrow, and specifically red bone marrow, which is why I'm calling it red. And surrounding this, we have our periosteum, which I'll do up in blue, out here. Here you can see sort of a close-up image. This is an electron micrograph, a scanning electron micrograph of spongy bone. And so you can see basically what it looks like. So you can see here this like kind of plate-looking doodad right here, that's a trabeculae, and you see these little spikes of tissue. Those are spicules. And then in between all of this spongy material would be your bone marrow. Spongy bone is dynamic. It's constantly being changed. So, and it's not being changed randomly. It's actually being changed based on the stresses that you put on it. It's really smart. So, for instance, we're examining here the head of a femur. And, you know, the way this person lives their life, the stress that they put on their femur, they've got a lot of stress that's coming down from directly on top. And you can see that the plates will actually line up so that all of the plates are running in a line along this stress line here. And then you also have some stress that comes in from the side, so you'll have the plates lining up along these side lines, like that, down there. And, of course, stress coming in from the greater trochanter, like that. So they grow in line so that their maximum strength is pointed along the stress line. So they're strongest in the area, in the direction that they need to be strongest, and then they're weaker in other directions. And if this person were to change their lifestyle, like let's say they moved from you know, an office job to a construction job, and they started carrying a lot more weight in weird areas, and that changed the way their stress lines lined up, then, you know, their bones would be complaining for a little bit at first, but these, the spongy bone would actually rearrange itself so that it helped resist the new mechanical stress and the new areas, the new way that stress was being applied to the body. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about bone remodeling and development. We've thrown around some bone marrow terms here, and I just want to remind you guys about bone marrow. So there's two types of bone marrow, and this is the tissue that is found inside of bones. It's found inside the marrow cavities of long bones and inside the spaces and between the trabeculae of spongy bone. And there's two types, red marrow and yellow marrow. Red marrow is sometimes called myeloid tissue, and it is it contains the tissue that produces blood cells. That's called hemopoietic tissue, which just means tissue that hemo is blood, poietic is basically genic, pretty much the same thing. So this is tissue that makes blood, produces blood cells. In children, they have, first off, smaller skeletal frames, but they still need a lot of blood. And so they have a lot more red bone marrow. In children, pretty much every bone has red bone marrow. In adults, it's only going to be found in certain cells. So even though every long bone has areas of spongy bone in it, in adults, some of that spongy bone is actually going to have yellow bone marrow in it, or will have non-hemopoietic bone marrow. In adults, the primary the primary bones that make red bone marrow are going to be found in the skull. Pretty much all the bones of the skull, you know, the mandible, the maxilla, frontal, temporal, occipital bones, all of those, they all have red bone marrow in them. The vertebrae are actually pretty nicely packed with red bone marrow. Your ribs and your sternum. Your sternum is actually you know, packed with a lot of red bone marrow in it. It plays a pretty important part in making red blood cells. Parts of the pelvic girdle, but not all of them, and the heads of the humerus and femur play a pretty important role in making blood. And in, like all of the other bones, inside all of the long bones, and inside the spongy bones of, the spongy heads of other bones, in adults at least, you're going to have yellow marrow. And yellow marrow is primarily fat cells. And so as you can tell, you know, if in children every bone has red marrow, and in adults only some bones have red marrow and the rest have yellow marrow, you can actually convert tissue back and forth between red and yellow marrow. And so let's say an adult has chronic anemia or some sort of condition that causes them to need to generate a lot more red blood cells over the long term. They can actually transform some of their yellow marrow back into red marrow. All right, so you can change your yellow marrow back into red marrow, but it takes time. It's not something that happens quickly, so it's only something that's going to happen if it's only something that's going to happen if you have a lack of blood for an extended period of time. All right, so let's recap and see what you need to know. First off, you need to know what the components of bone tissue are. What are the components of the, so components of ECM. You need to know the organic components. And you need to know the inorganic components. The organic components are going to be primarily collagen. The inorganic components are going to be primarily hydroxyapatite, but also a reasonable amount of calcium carbonate. You need to know the 4 cell types. And their functions. You need to know the structure of compact bone and spongy bone. And you need to know the 2 types of marrow. And where they would be found. And make sure that you know the ratios between organic and inorganic. Organic is 1/3 of the dry weight, and inorganic is 2/3 of the dry weight.